I would describe Raven as fun, loving, the life of the room, probably the most fashionable in the room.
Jakara says her best friend Raven Gant had a knack for style, and she earned it.
Raven has always been a super hard worker.
Raven was an accounts manager at Union Depot Hotel, a hardworking mom to JJ.
I want her to know that she had an awesome mom who loved her very, very much.
She uses the past tense because Raven was killed on Thanksgiving Day.
It was just like any other holiday. And I had no idea of all of this that was going on because of the lengths that my sister was going through to protect this man.
That man is JJ's dad, Randall Watkins.
My daughter knew that she was being abused, and she tried to get out of it. But by the time she tried to get out of it, it was a little bit too late.
Raven and JJ had moved out of Watkins' home. Police reports say Raven went back Thanksgiving to retrieve clothes when Watkins shot her with little JJ close by.
She was my backbone, my rock, and I miss her every second, every minute of the day.
Now she hopes her family's story of devastation will give others strength to walk away.
That's not okay for any women, for any young adult, for no female to experience. It's just not right.
On the evening of November 28, 2019, 27-year-old Raven Gant traveled to a residence in North Minneapolis where she had previously lived with 41-year-old Randall Jermaine Watkins, the father of her 2-year-old daughter. Earlier that night, multiple calls were made to 911 reporting a domestic dispute at the address on James Avenue North. The parties involved provided conflicting accounts of the situation to dispatchers. Minneapolis police responded and made initial contact, but did not enter the residence. Shortly thereafter, additional communications to emergency services indicated the conflict persisted. Police subsequently returned. Inside the home, officers located Gant lying inside the doorway between the kitchen and dining room with a gunshot wound. Watkins was taken into custody at the front door. A toddler present in the residence provided identifying information to officers. The sequence of these events initiated a criminal investigation, prosecution by Hennepin County, and later a sentence following trial and conviction. Stay with us as we unravel this shocking story and uncover the heartbreaking details of what led to this senseless loss. Before we begin, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what are your thoughts as the story unfolds? Welcome to True Crime Tales, where we reveal the crimes that shock communities and the secrets hidden behind closed doors. These are real people, real events, real consequences. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Now let's begin. Raven Gant was a 27-year-old woman living in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She was raised in a close-knit family environment where relatives maintained regular contact and remained involved in one another's lives. From an early age, Raven was known within her family as dependable and independent. She maintained strong relationships with her mother and extended family members, who later became central figures in preserving her memory and advocating for accountability in her case. Raven completed her education in Minnesota and entered the workforce at a young age. She held steady employment and was described by co-workers as organized and reliable. At the time leading up to her death, Raven worked in hotel management, a role that required attention to detail, customer interaction, and consistent scheduling. Her employment provided financial stability and structure, which she prioritized after becoming a parent. Socially, Raven was outgoing and well-connected. Friends describe her as fashion-forward and confident in her appearance. She maintained an active social circle and regularly communicated with friends and family through calls and messages. Despite her social nature, those close to her noted that she took her responsibilities seriously and did not engage in reckless behavior. She balanced social interactions with work obligations and parenting duties. Motherhood became a defining part of Raven's daily life. She gave birth to her daughter during her relationship with Randall Watkins. After becoming a mother, Raven structured her routine around her child's needs. Her days were organized around childcare, work schedules, and transportation. She managed daycare arrangements, medical appointments, and daily care responsibilities. Family members later stated that Raven was focused on creating consistency for her daughter and was actively planning for long-term stability. Following the end of her romantic relationship, Raven made efforts to move forward independently. She no longer resided full-time with Watkins and began organizing her life separately. This included maintaining her own schedule, arranging childcare independently, and managing her personal belongings apart from him. According to later court records and family statements, Raven's focus during this period was practical, securing her property, maintaining access to her child, and minimizing conflict. Raven Gant met Randall Watkins several years before her death. Their relationship progressed quickly, and the two eventually lived together. Early in the relationship, there were no public indications of instability. Friends and family were aware of the relationship, but did not initially express concern. As the relationship continued, Raven became pregnant, and the couple welcomed a daughter. During this period, they continued to cohabitate. However, over time, the relationship began to deteriorate. Disagreements became more frequent, and communication between the two grew strained. According to later testimony and investigative findings, the conflict centered on control, living arrangements, and access to shared property. Family members later reported that Raven began to express frustration over Watkins' behavior. These concerns included arguments about where Raven would live, how often she could come and go, and disagreements regarding her personal belongings. There were also disputes related to parenting responsibilities and scheduling involving their daughter. As the relationship declined, friends and relatives observed changes in Raven's situation. She appeared increasingly focused on creating distance and maintaining independence. While Raven did not publicly disclose all details of the conflicts, those close to her noted that the relationship no longer appeared stable. Evidence introduced later suggested a pattern of escalating tension. Disagreements were not isolated incidents, but part of an ongoing conflict that intensified after the relationship ended. These disputes did not immediately result in legal intervention, but they laid the groundwork for later confrontations. The breakup between Raven Gant and Randall Watkins occurred prior to November 2019. After separation, Raven no longer lived with Watkins full-time. Despite the end of their romantic relationship, the two remained connected due to their shared child. This required continued communication regarding custody, visitation, and logistics. Disagreements over custody arrangements became a recurring issue. There were conflicts regarding when Raven could see her daughter and under what conditions. According to later court documents, Watkins maintained control over certain aspects of access, which contributed to ongoing disputes. Another significant point of conflict involved Raven's personal belongings. After leaving the shared residence, Raven did not retrieve all of her items. Some of her clothing, personal effects, and items belonging to her daughter remained at Watkins' home. Raven made multiple attempts to retrieve these belongings. These efforts were described as direct but nonviolent. Communication records and testimony later established that Raven and Watkins exchanged messages leading up to Thanksgiving Day. The purpose of these communications was to arrange a time for Raven to collect her property. This visit was not spontaneous. It was planned in advance, with the understanding that Raven would arrive, retrieve her belongings, and leave. On Thanksgiving Day, November 28, 2019, Raven traveled to Watkins' residence with her daughter. She brought a bag with her, consistent with the stated purpose of collecting personal items. The situation that unfolded inside the home was the culmination of weeks of unresolved conflict. Police records later confirmed that a domestic dispute occurred that evening. A call was made to emergency services, reporting an argument. Officers responded but left without entering the residence. After their departure, further communication occurred between Raven and Watkins. The sequence of events that followed would later become a central focus of the criminal investigation. What was initially framed as a routine property retrieval escalated into a fatal encounter. The context surrounding the visit, ongoing disputes, control issues, and unresolved tensions became critical in understanding how the situation deteriorated. On the morning of November 28, 2019, Raven Gant began Thanksgiving Day following her normal routine. At 27 years old, She was living separately from her former partner, Randall Watkins, with whom she shared a 2-year-old daughter. Their relationship had ended prior to that day, but unresolved matters remained between them, including personal belongings and items belonging to their child. Throughout the earlier part of the day, Raven was caring for her daughter and communicating with family members. There was no indication that the day would end differently from other exchanges between her and Watkins. The purpose of her eventual visit was specific. She intended to retrieve personal items and belongings for her child from Watkins' residence in North Minneapolis, a home they previously shared. At some point later in the day, Raven made the decision to go to Watkins' residence in person. The decision was not spontaneous. According to later court records, the issue of retrieving property had been ongoing, and Raven believed that appearing in person would allow her to collect the items and leave without further complication. She brought her 2-year-old daughter with her, a factor that would later become central to how the events unfolded. Raven arrived at the residence during the evening hours. The home was a single-family house located in a residential neighborhood. Upon entry, the environment inside the residence was described as dimly lit. There were no other adults present in the home at the time besides Raven and Watkins. The child remained with Raven throughout the encounter. The initial interaction between Raven and Watkins began as a conversation focused on the belongings she had come to retrieve. According to investigative reports, the discussion quickly escalated into an argument. The disagreement centered on Watkins' refusal to allow Raven to leave the residence with certain items, including clothing and property she identified as hers or a child's. As the argument continued, tension inside the residence increased. Raven made repeated attempts to leave the home with her belongings. Watkins allegedly blocked her exit and refused to allow her to leave. The dispute remained confined to the interior of the house, with no immediate involvement from neighbors or outside witnesses. The child was present during the argument and remained in close proximity to both adults. As the situation escalated, a 911 call was placed reporting a domestic dispute at the residence. The 911 call reported a disagreement between two individuals inside the home. The information provided to dispatch indicated that the dispute involved a refusal to allow one party to leave the residence. Officers from the Minneapolis Police Department were dispatched to the address in response to the call. When officers arrived at the scene, they approached the residence and observed the exterior of the home. The house appeared quiet from the outside. Lights inside were limited, and there were no visible signs of an active disturbance occurring at the time of their arrival. Officers did not enter the residence. Instead, they made a brief assessment from outside. According to later court documents, the officers did not make direct contact with Raven inside the home. There was limited interaction between law enforcement and the occupants of the residence. After assessing the exterior conditions and not observing immediate signs of violence, the officers made the decision to leave the scene. No arrests were made during this initial response. No formal report of separation between the parties was enforced. Importantly, the officers did not require either individual to leave the residence. Watkins was not removed from the home, and Raven was not escorted out. No protective measures were put in place to separate the parties involved in the dispute. Additionally, the 2-year-old child remained inside the residence. No action was taken to remove the child from the environment or to ensure her safety away from the ongoing conflict. The officers departed the scene without further intervention. After police left the residence, Raven remained inside the home with Watkins. The presence of law enforcement did not result in a resolution of conflict. The disagreement over property continued. There was no documented de-escalation following the police departure. Instead, the absence of law enforcement allowed the argument to resume without outside oversight. Raven was still attempting to leave the residence with her belongings. Watkins continued to refuse. The situation inside the home became increasingly volatile. The voices were raised and the argument intensified. According to later evidence presented in court, the dispute moved between rooms inside the house as Raven attempted to collect her items. Throughout this period, the child remained present inside the home. There was no physical separation between the child and the ongoing dispute. The child was exposed to the escalating confrontation between the adults. At no point during this interval did Raven successfully exit the residence. She remained inside, despite her repeated attempts to leave. There was no third-party intervention following the initial police response. The lack of de-escalation following the officer's departure became a critical factor in the sequence of events that followed. The unresolved conflict, combined the continued proximity between the parties and the presence of firearm inside the home, created conditions that would soon escalate further. Within a short time after police left the scene, a second 911 call would be placed. What occurred next would permanently alter the lives of those involved and become the focus of a criminal investigation, a jury trial, and a 40-year prison sentence. After officers cleared the scene following the initial domestic disturbance call, the situation inside the residence did not resolve. A second call to law enforcement was placed later that evening. The call indicated renewed concern at the same North Minneapolis address involving the same individuals. Dispatch records show the call came in shortly after officers had already left the area, suggesting that conditions inside the residence escalated in a short time span. Before officers were able to return to home, a gunshot was fired inside the residence. The timing of the shot occurred minutes before police arrival, according to emergency call logs and subsequent investigative findings. There were no reports of additional shots fired. Raven Gant was shot inside the house. Investigators later confirmed that the gunshot caused a fatal wound. The shooting occurred during a confrontation inside the residence, where Raven had gone to retrieve personal belongings. No evidence suggested forced entry, indicating that she was inside the home of the occupant at the time of the incident. Raven was later found on the main level of the residence, located near a transitional area between rooms. Law enforcement reports identified the location as an interior space connecting common areas of the home, not near an exterior door. This placement was documented during the crime scene investigation and corroborated by photographs and officer testimony. A 2-year-old child, the daughter of Raven Gant and Randall Watkins, was present inside the residence at the time the shooting occurred. The child was in close proximity to the immediate environment where the incident took place, though not physically harmed. The presence of the child became a critical factor in the investigation, influencing both prosecutorial decisions and later court proceedings. Police arrived in response to the second call and made entry into the residence. Upon entering, officers conducted a rapid assessment of the scene. They observed Raven Gant lying unresponsive. Officers confirmed that she was not conscious and showed no signs of voluntary movement. Emergency medical procedures were initiated immediately. Officers requested medical assistance and began life-saving measures consistent with their training while waiting for paramedics to arrive. The condition of the victim was documented at the scene, including the visible gunshot wound. Paramedics arrived shortly afterward and assumed medical care. Raven was prepared for transport as a priority patient. The firearm involved in the incident was not actively in use when officers arrived and was secured during the scene control process. Raven Gant was transported from the residence to North Memorial Medical Center by emergency medical personnel. She was listed in critical condition upon arrival. Medical staff attempted life-saving interventions based on trauma protocols. Despite these efforts, Raven Gant was pronounced deceased at the hospital. The cause of death was confirmed as a gunshot wound. The medical examiner later ruled the death a homicide, consistent with the findings of law enforcement and forensic analysis. Randall Watkins was detained at the scene by responding officers. He was taken into custody without incident. At the time of detention, officers conducted a preliminary assessment to ensure scene safety and prevent further risk. Watkins was separated from the residence and placed under police supervision. The firearm used in the shooting was recovered from inside the home. The weapon was secured as evidence and later submitted for forensic testing. Ballistics analysis confirmed that the recovered firearm was consistent with the weapon used to shoot Raven Gant. The child was located inside the residence during the police response. Officers ensured the child's immediate safety and arranged for her removal from the home. Child Protection Services and family members were notified. The child was released into the care of relatives, consistent with standard procedures in cases involving domestic homicide. Initial statements were obtained from Randall Watkins at the scene. Law enforcement documented his account of events, noting inconsistencies that would later become significant during the investigation. Additional statements were gathered from responding officers. emergency medical personnel, and individuals connected to the earlier police call. The residence was secured as an active crime scene. Detectives arrived to begin a formal investigation, including evidence collection, scene documentation, and witness interviews. Items collected included the firearm, shell casing, and personal belongings relevant to the timeline of events. Following the initial investigation, Randall Watkins was formally arrested. He was booked into custody and held pending charges. The arrest was based on probable cause established through physical evidence, witness accounts, and his presence at the scene during the shooting. Prosecutors filed multiple charges against Watkins. The primary charge was second-degree murder, alleging that he caused the death of Raven Gant through intentional or dangerous conduct involving a firearm. Under Minnesota law, second-degree murder does not require premeditation, but does require proof that the defendant's actions directly resulted in death. In addition to the murder charge, Watkins faced firearm-related offenses. These included illegal possession and use of a firearm during the commission of a violent crime. Prosecutors cited his status and the circumstances under which the weapon was used as aggravating factors. The legal definition of second-degree murder was outlined in court filings, emphasizing that the prosecution did not need to prove long-term planning, only that Watkins intentionally fired the weapon or acted with depraved disregard for human life. Firearm charges further strengthened the case by establishing unlawful conduct independent of the homicide charge. During court proceedings, prosecutors outlined their theory of the case. They argued that Raven Gant had gone to the residence solely to retrieve her belongings and attempted to leave. They presented evidence that the situation escalated after police left the first time, culminating in the fatal shooting before officers could return. The prosecution highlighted the sequence of events, the presence of the child, and the recovery of the firearm as key components of their case. They also emphasized the earlier police call as context demonstrating that law enforcement intervention had already occurred and failed to prevent the escalation. Watkins was held for trial following the filing of charges. Bail determinations, pretrial hearings, and motions followed, setting the stage for a full jury trial. Ultimately, the case proceeded to the court system, resulting in a conviction and sentencing that reflected the severity of the charges. The investigation into the death of 27-year-old Raven Gant began immediately following the second police response to the North Minneapolis residence on Thanksgiving Day, November 28, 2019. Officers arrived at the scene after receiving a report of a shooting. Upon entry, law enforcement located Raven Gant lying unresponsive inside the home. A firearm was recovered at the scene, and Randall Watkins, the child's father and Raven's former partner, was detained without incident. Investigators secured the residence and conducted a systematic search. Physical evidence collected included the handgun used in the shooting, spent shell casings, bloodstained patterns, and Raven Gant's personal belongings. Officers documented the position of her body, the location of the weapon, and the layout of the home, particularly the kitchen and dining area where the shooting occurred. The presence of the couple's 2-year-old daughter inside the residence was noted and documented as part of the scene. The medical examiner determined that Raven Gant died from a gunshot wound. The trajectory of the bullet and the nature of the wound were consistent with the firearm recovered from the residence. Gunshot residue testing and ballistic analysis linked the weapon directly to the fatal shot. No evidence suggested the involvement of a third party. The findings supported the conclusion that the shooting occurred inside the home during an ongoing domestic dispute. Investigators reviewed body camera footage from both police responses that evening. The footage showed officers responding earlier to a domestic disturbance call involving Raven Gant and Randall Watkins. During the first response, officers spoke briefly with Watkins at the door. The house appeared dark, and Raven was not seen on camera. Officers cleared the call without entering the residence. Body camera footage from the second response documented the immediate aftermath of the shooting, the discovery of Raven's body, and Watkins being taken into custody. Multiple 911 calls were reviewed as part of the investigation. The first call involved a domestic dispute regarding Raven attempting to retrieve personal belongings from a home. A second call was placed later, reporting a shooting. Dispatch logs and audio recordings established the timeline between the initial police visit, their departure, and the fatal incident. Investigators analyzed how the calls were categorized, the information relayed to officers, and the response time for each call. The police response timeline became a key focus of the investigation. Records showed that officers responded to the first call, spoke briefly with Watkins, and left the scene without confirming Raven's safety. Less than an hour later, officers were dispatched again following the report of shooting. Internal reviews examined whether standard procedures for domestic violence calls were followed and whether additional intervention could have altered the outcome. This timeline later became relevant in civil proceedings but did not alter the criminal charges. Family members provided statements outlining Raven Gant's relationship history with Watkins. These statements describe ongoing conflict, efforts by Raven to separate from Watkins, and disputes over access to personal property and their child. Family members confirmed that Raven had gone to the residence to retrieve belongings and leave with her daughter. These statements were included to establish context and prior conflict rather than emotional testimony. During pre-trial hearings, the court addressed evidentiary issues, witness lists, and admissibility of prior incidents between Raven Gant and Randall Watkins. Prosecutors sought to introduce evidence of past domestic conflict to establish motive and pattern. The defense challenged the relevance of prior disputes, arguing they were prejudicial. The defense asserted that the shooting was not premeditated and argued that Watkins did not intend to kill Raven. They questioned the interpretation of forensic evidence and attempted to cast doubt on the sequence of events leading up to the shooting. The defense also challenged police handling of the initial domestic disturbance call. The prosecution's case focused on establishing intent and responsibility through three primary elements. Prosecutors presented evidence that the relationship between Raven and Watkins had deteriorated, marked by arguments and control issues. Testimony showed that Raven was attempting to leave the relationship and retrieve her belongings, which prosecutors argued escalated the confrontation. Evidence demonstrated that Watkins restricted Raven's ability to leave the residence with her belongings. Prosecutors argued that the refusal to allow her to leave and the escalation to gun violence showed deliberate action rather than an accident. The prosecution emphasized that the couple's 2-year-old daughter was inside the home at the time of the shooting. This factor was used to demonstrate recklessness and disregard for human life, both Raven's and the child's. Responding officers testified about their interactions with Watkins, the condition of the scene, and their observations during both police responses. Investigators explained how evidence was collected and how timelines were established. Body camera footage and dispatch records were introduced through officer testimony. Family members testified regarding Raven's efforts to end the relationship and retrieve her belongings. Their testimony focused on factual interactions, communication records, and the events leading up to Thanksgiving Day. Emotional appeals were limited, with testimony centered on establishing context. The prosecution presented the firearm, ballistic reports, forensic findings, 911 recordings, text messages, and body camera footage. Digital evidence supported the timeline and contradicted defense claims regarding the nature of the confrontation. After closing arguments, the jury deliberated on the charges, including second-degree murder. Jurors reviewed the evidence, testimony, and legal instructions before reaching a verdict. The jury returned a guilty verdict on all applicable counts. The verdict confirmed that Randall Watkins was criminally responsible for the death of Raven Gant. Watkins was convicted of second-degree murder. The conviction reflected the jury's conclusion that the shooting was intentional and occurred during a domestic dispute. During sentencing, the court reviewed victim impact statements, legal arguments, and statutory sentencing guidelines. Prosecutors requested the maximum sentence, citing the presence of the child and the nature of the crime. Randall Watkins was sentenced to 40 years in prison, the maximum allowable under Minnesota law for conviction. The judge referenced the severity of the crime, the breach of trust inherent in domestic violence cases, and the irreversible consequences of Watkins' actions. The court formally acknowledged that the couple's child was present in the home during the killing. This factor was cited as an aggravating circumstance, influencing the length of the sentence. Following the conclusion of the criminal trial and the sentencing of Randall Watkins, immediate decisions had to be made regarding the custody and care of Raven Gant's daughter. At the time of Raven's death, the child was 2 years old and had been present in the home during the incident. With the biological father convicted and sentenced to a lengthy prison term, custody was transferred to Raven's family. Court records and media reports indicate that the child was placed under the care of Raven's mother, who assumed full legal and physical responsibility. The transition involved both legal and logistical considerations. Guardianship proceedings required documentation, court approvals, and coordination with child welfare authorities to ensure continuity of care. Beyond legal custody, Raven's family faced the responsibility of restructuring daily routines, child care arrangements, and long-term planning for the child's education, health care, and housing. These adjustments occurred while the family was also navigating ongoing court appearances, media inquiries, and public attention surrounding the case. Raven's mother emerged as the primary spokesperson for the family during and after the trial. In multiple public statements, she emphasized that her focus had shifted to protecting and raising her granddaughter while ensuring that Raven's death was not reduced to statistic. She consistently highlighted that Raven had been attempting to move forward with her life, and that the events of Thanksgiving Day were connected to unresolved conflicts surrounding personal belongings and control. Her statements were direct and factual, often centered on the sequence of events and the consequences of delayed intervention. The long-term implications of the child remain significant. Growing up without either parent present creates structural challenges that extend into education, identity formation, and stability. Legal experts have noted that children who witness or are present during violent incidents often require long-term support services, even if immediate signs of trauma are not outwardly visible. In this case, the child's exposure became part of the court record, reinforcing the seriousness of the offense and influencing sentencing considerations. From a practical standpoint, the family has had to plan for future disclosures to the child regarding the circumstances of Raven's death. This includes determining when and how information will be shared, as well as preparing for potential legal, psychological, and social questions that may arise as the child grows older. These realities form an ongoing consequence of the crime, extending beyond the prison sentence and into the next generation. In the days following Raven Gant's death, vigils and memorials were held in Minneapolis, particularly in North Minneapolis where the incident occurred. These gatherings were organized by family members, community leaders, and local advocacy groups. They served as public acknowledgments of the case and as forums for discussing domestic violence and safety concerns. Candles, photographs, and written messages were displayed, often emphasizing the presence of children in domestic violence cases. Public reaction across Minneapolis was substantial. Local residents expressed concern about the circumstances surrounding the police response, particularly the fact that officers had initially responded to a domestic disturbance call and left without entering the home. This aspect of the case became a focal point in public discussions, shifting attention from the individual crime to broader questions about procedure and accountability. Domestic violence advocacy organizations became actively involved following the incident. These groups used the case to highlight warning signs commonly present in abusive relationships, such as disputes over personal belongings, attempts to leave, and control over movement. Advocates also stress the importance of treating domestic disturbance calls as high-risk situations, especially when children are involved. Several organizations cited Raven Gant's case in training sessions, public forums, and education materials aimed at both law enforcement and the general public. Media coverage played a central role in sustaining public discussion. Local television stations, newspapers, and national outlets reported extensively on the case, covering the arrest, trial, sentencing, and subsequent civil actions. Reporting often included timelines of police response, excerpts from court testimony, and statements from Raven's family. As the case progressed through appeals and related civil litigation, it continued to receive attention, reinforcing its relevance beyond a single criminal proceeding. The sustained media focus ensured that the case remained part of broader conversations about domestic violence, policing, and systemic accountability. It also contributed to increased public awareness of how quickly domestic disputes can escalate and how institutional responses can influence outcomes. One of the most closely examined aspects of the Raven Gant case is the initial police response on Thanksgiving Day. Records show that officers were dispatched following a report of a domestic disturbance involving a dispute over belongings. When officers arrived, they observed a quiet, darkened residence and did not make contact with anyone inside. They left the scene without entering the home or conducting a welfare check. This decision later became a central point of scrutiny. Legal analysts and civil rights advocates questioned whether this response met the expected standard of care for domestic violence calls. Domestic disturbance incidents are widely recognized as unpredictable and potentially dangerous, particularly when there is a known history of conflict between the parties. The fact that a second call was later made, followed by the fatal shooting, raised questions about whether earlier intervention could have altered the outcome. The case prompted discussions around missed intervention opportunities. Critics argued that additional steps, such as knocking persistently, entering the residence, or separating the parties, might have de-escalated the situation. Others pointed to systemic constraints, including limited information available to responding officers and existing departmental policies. These debates highlighted the complexity of decision-making in real-time policing situations. Legal discussions also emerged regarding the duty of care owed by law enforcement during domestic disputes. Civil litigation connected to the case examined whether the police response constituted negligence and whether constitutional or statutory obligations were breached. Appeals related to these civil actions have continued to shape how the case is interpreted within legal frameworks, particularly in relation to qualified immunity and municipal liability. Beyond this individual case, the broader implications for domestic violence prevention are significant. The events surrounding Raven Gant's death have been cited in policy discussions, training reforms, and advocacy efforts aimed at improving response protocols. The case underscores the importance of early intervention, comprehensive risk assessment, and clear procedures when responding to domestic disputes. Ultimately, the systemic issues exposed by this case extend beyond Minneapolis. They reflect national challenges in balancing officer discretion, victim protection, and institutional accountability. Raven Gant's case remains a reference point in discussions about how systems respond to domestic violence and what changes may be necessary to prevent similar outcomes in the future. The case of Raven Gant has continued to be referenced in discussions involving domestic violence, police response to domestic disputes, and legal accountability in Minnesota. Since the conclusion of the criminal proceedings, the case has remained part of public records, legal analyses, and advocacy conversations due to the sequence of events that preceded the homicide and the documented opportunities for intervention. Raven Gant's death is often cited because it involved multiple critical elements frequently present in domestic violence cases: a prior relationship marked by conflict, an attempt by the victim to retrieve personal property, police involvement shortly before the fatal incident, and the presence of a child at the scene. These factors have made the case relevant in examining how domestic disputes escalate and how institutional responses influence outcomes. Legal scholars and public safety discussions have referenced the case when addressing response protocols during domestic disturbance calls. The timeline of police contact on the night of November 28, 2019, has been reviewed in civil litigation, court opinions, and public commentary. This has positioned the case as a reference point in evaluating decision-making during domestic calls where no immediate arrest is made. The case has also been cited in discussions about firearm access in domestic situations, particularly where there is a documented history of disputes between intimate partners. Prosecutors reference the sequence of events to illustrate how rapidly a domestic confrontation can escalate into lethal violence when a firearm is present in the home. Following the conclusion of the criminal case, Raven Gant's family became involved in advocacy efforts centered on domestic violence awareness and prevention. These efforts focus on educating the public about warning signs commonly present in abusive relationships and encouraging individuals to seek help before situations escalate. Family members publicly discuss the importance of recognizing controlling behaviors, such as withholding personal belongings, restricting movement, and using intimidation during disputes. These behaviors were highlighted as factors that were present prior to the fatal incident and were later examined during trial proceedings. Advocacy initiatives connected to the family emphasize the importance of victims having safe and supported methods to retrieve belongings from former partners. The case has been referenced in discussions about law enforcement escorts, third-party involvement, and court-ordered property exchanges as preventative measures. The family also participated in conversations about the long-term impact on children who are present during domestic violence incidents. The presence of Raven Gant's 2-year-old daughter during the events of that night has been used in educational contexts to stress the broader consequences of domestic violence beyond the immediate victim. In addition to public advocacy, the family pursued accountability through civil legal avenues. Lawsuits and legal filings examined whether established procedures were followed during the initial police response. These actions contributed to ongoing dialogue about policy improvements and institutional responsibility. Raven Gant's case is frequently included in domestic violence awareness discussions due to its clear timeline and documented interactions with law enforcement. Advocates use the case to demonstrate how domestic violence does not always involve prior arrests or visible injuries, but can still present a high risk of lethal escalation. The case is referenced in training materials and public forums to illustrate the danger associated with separation periods in abusive relationships. Experts consistently note that attempts to leave or retrieve belongings are among the most dangerous moments for victims, a factor directly reflected in this case. Domestic violence organizations have pointed to the case when discussing the limitations of relying solely on verbal assessments during police calls. The fact that officers responded to a dispute, did not enter the residence, and later returned after the shooting has been analyzed in terms of policy and practice. The case has also been used to highlight the importance of firearm removal in volatile domestic situations. Advocates note that the presence of guns significantly increases the likelihood of fatal outcomes in domestic disputes, a reality underscored by the events of November 28, 2019. Public awareness campaigns have included the case when addressing misconceptions about domestic violence, particularly the assumption that danger only exists when there is visible physical harm. The documented history of disputes and control issues contradicted that assumption. During sentencing and subsequent public statements, prosecutors emphasized that the case demonstrated how predictable patterns of escalation can lead to fatal outcomes when not interrupted. The prosecution outlined how the argument over personal belongings, combined a history of conflict and access to a firearm, created a high-risk situation. Advocates have highlighted several key lessons drawn from the case. Domestic disputes involving former partners should be treated as high-risk situations, particularly when children are present. Attempt to retrieve belongings from an ex-partner should involve safety planning and, when possible, third-party assistance. Law enforcement responses must account for potential escalation risk, even when both parties appear calm at initial contact. Firearm access in domestic settings requires heightened scrutiny during disputes. The case reinforced the importance of thorough documentation and follow-up in domestic violence calls. Prosecutors noted that timelines, call logs, and officer actions became critical elements in understanding how events unfolded. Legal experts have also pointed to the case as an example of how criminal accountability functions after escalation has already occurred, rather than preventing the escalation itself. This distinction has been central to discussions about prevention-focused reforms. The case of Raven Gant can be summarized as a documented sequence of events involving a domestic dispute, police contact, and a fatal escalation within a defined time frame. On November 28, 2019, Raven Gant went to a residence she previously shared with Randall Watkins to retrieve personal items. A dispute occurred. Police were contacted. Officers responded and later left the scene. A subsequent call resulted in officers returning to find Raven Gant had been shot. Randall Watkins was arrested at the scene. He was charged, tried, and convicted of second-degree murder. The court imposed a 40-year prison sentence, reflecting the severity of the offense and the presence of aggravating factors, including the involvement of a firearm and the presence of a child. The legal outcome established accountability for the act itself. The broader examination of the case extended beyond the criminal conviction to include institutional response, domestic violence risk assessment, and prevention strategies. When reviewed as a whole, the case serves as a documented example of how domestic conflicts can escalate rapidly and lethally. The sequence of decisions, responses, and conditions that preceded the shooting illustrates a pattern that has been identified in numerous domestic violence cases nationwide. The case remains referenced not for its emotional impact, but for its factual clarity and instructional value. It stands as an example used in discussions about preventable escalation, procedural accountability, and the importance of intervention before disputes reach irreversible outcomes. If you found this story as gripping and heartbreaking as we did, don't forget to like this video and share it with others. And if you want to hear more true crime stories that uncover the mysteries behind these tragic events, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell. You won't want to miss our latest stories, updates, and discussions. Thank you for joining us on this journey to seek justice and explore the truth. Together, we can make a difference. Until next time, stay safe and stay aware.